We're here to talk about HR strategy, right? So we're going to look at a couple different things related to HR strategy. We'll look at why HR strategic plans fail. I think it's important for us to figure out why that is, what happens, what are the common denominators there. We'll look at how do we link our HR strategy back to the business strategy. What are the connecting points? Let me start off by asking, how many of you would say that your business doesn't value the HR function to the level you think it should be? Okay, a third of you or so, at least those of you willing to admit it, right? And that's not necessarily a reflection on us as HR professionals. Sometimes it's a reflection of the outside world and their perception. We're going to talk about how we create those links. We're going to look at what we should include in our strategic plan. Maybe it's going to be a little bit more in-depth than you had thought of previously. Maybe not, but we'll take a look at that. And then finally, I'm a big believer in action planning. You know, we come to these conferences, we get the big data dump into our brains, and if we don't take time to really think about what we've learned and process it and come up with an action plan for ourselves, sometimes all this good time and investment goes to waste. So we're going to look at how we can get some action planning rolling along too. So let's start off with why plans fail. First one shouldn't be a surprise, it's communication. So when we think about communication in terms of HR, what are your biggest challenges in the workplace when it comes to communication? Okay.
For me, it's that we work 24/7.
Okay.
It's hard to keep up with those people on different types of
Different
shifts.
shifts, so the whole shift work thing. Okay, that's a good one. What else? Yeah.
Getting the some 40-some-odd thousand people to actually read the communication.
Ah, okay. All right, so we
And
have,
not just,
whether it's...
and not just see the title and then call it a question.
Sure.
Read the
Okay,
whole
so when we have really mass communication with extremely large workforces, that's a challenge for us. What else? Yeah.
We have 170 people working in various locations and working in people's homes.
Okay.
So we're like a type of provider agency.
Okay.
And we have put many systems in place to help aid us in communicating with people, like electronic timekeeping that has e-notify, but nobody will use this stuff.
So you got the tools in place, but people just don't want to take the time to learn it or
Yes.
use it. Okay.
They'll even say things like, I really wish you would have faxed that to me.
Sure. So, okay, faxing. There's an interesting concept. What's old is new again, right? So from a communication standpoint, one of the biggest challenges, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands here, but if you have a strategic HR plan now, a formal one, not just one that's up here, but a formal one, how well have you communicated? You know, if you stepped out of yourself, how would you rate how well you've communicated that plan to the rest of the management team and the people who are responsible for implementing that plan? So that's the first thing I want you to think about. You know, there's certainly been a lot of studies done around communication in terms of employee benefits. Can anyone share with me something they've read about communicating and employee benefits and what the link is there?
Well, I mean, they're not going to use it unless they know it's available.
Know it's
and not a
available,
benefit.
okay.
If they're not using it, it's not a true benefit. So
Sure.
it's a
Waste of money, right? One of the studies that I found, actually that's been done numerous times, it seems to indicate that you can communicate the heck out of a really bad benefits plan, and people think they've got the best benefits plan going, right? Because they understand it. But then you can offer them the Cadillac of benefit plans and not really tell them much about it, and they'll be grumbling and mumbling about it, right? So we know, and I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but we know that communication is absolutely critical. And so it's going to be no different with our HR strategic plans. It doesn't do us any good to develop the plan we're going to talk about today and then hide it under the rock. Now, let me ask you this, and this I would like a show of hands. How many of you know, one, that your company has a strategic plan and that you've seen it and been able to access it? Excellent. Okay, so maybe about half. Okay, that's good. Okay, the other half, of those of you that did not raise your hands, how many of you would say you don't have a strategic plan? Okay, only a couple. So those of you, the rest of you then would say that you have a strategic plan, but it hasn't been shared out. Is that correct? Is that what okay, is that a problem? How do we achieve our strategic goals if the company develops a strategic plan? Probably all the executives went off to a retreat, right? They came to Tantara Resort, for a week, and they came back with this nice binder and said, we hired this consultant, we got this great strategic plan, and they don't tell anybody about it. Is that plan going to succeed? It's impossible, right? Second reason plans fail, no surprise, leadership, right? So we already had half of you say that you believe your company has a strategic plan, but it hasn't been shared. That's a leadership issue, right? You can't possibly have the top executives in an organization, even if they work diligently towards that strategic plan and hope to achieve that strategic plan, if they don't delegate some of the elements of that plan out to the rank and file. And the same thing is going to be true of our HR strategic plan. We're going to see that we as the HR leaders have a piece in its implementation clearly, but also those that we rely on to help us in HR. Even if we're a staff of one, we certainly have other managers out on the floor that are hiring managers. You have other departmental managers that you rely on to make sure that HR is happening. So I love this one, right? So this is a real picture, by the way. When I found the picture, I thought, did this really happen? And apparently it did. Yes, it really did happen. Now, can you imagine, right? Gee, we're building this bridge from two sides, and whoops. Okay. That picture alone illustrates what happens with the disconnects from communication and leadership, right? We're building now. We're compounding the problem. So some engineers drew up the plan for this bridge, right? And I'm sure in the plans that bridge connected. Okay, they didn't plan it out like this. But somewhere the communication, whether it was the starting point or maybe there was a bend in the bridge, who knows, they end up like this. Okay? And so what this comes back to is our ability to implement the plan effectively. To take it from words on the page into a living document. This is the disconnect that happens, hopefully not on this grand scale, right, with our plans if we don't integrate communication and leadership together. Okay? For those of you that are a fan of The Office, we can make fun of Michael Scott all we want, but I'm also willing to bet you've got some Michael Scotts running around in your office, right? So when we look at a guy like Michael Scott, he was really well-meaning, right? He was kind of naive. He was a well-meaning guy. What was his biggest problem? Well, okay, he was an idiot. Okay. What's that?
I said he was an idiot.
Okay, but no, there was someone else said something. Okay, his mouth would get him in trouble. He really, when you think about it, if you go back and just think of watching The Office from a pure business perspective, not just the comedic value of it, he was a very passive manager, was he not? He was never in the office. He was off planning the parties. He was off on his little adventures, hoping that things were going to get done. Things don't get done that way, right? We're in leadership positions because we've been given some responsibility to make things happen. And so when we start talking about how we implement HR strategic planning, we're going to look at who are our doers. We don't want the passive managers on our team. We don't want the folks who come to the meetings and sit there and don't say anything. I'd rather have them not show up than take a seat and then not say anything through the entire time. Or, worse yet, agree to do things for us and not do them. Okay? So we want to get rid of any of the passives on our team. Fifth reason is motivation. What's in it for the team to hit the goals? We could talk this entire conference about different types of motivation. Employee engagement, how we do it, why we do it, what doesn't work. What I find when it comes to employee engagement is everything's got to be personalized. So have any of you ever read the book called Hug Your People? No? Never heard that? Add that to your library. It's an easy read. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the author's name right now. But the gentleman owns a chain, 5 or 6 high-end business clothing stores from Manhattan up in through Connecticut. And he wrote the book, and it really just talks about how he motivates his people every day. And sure, his salespeople have a commission-type structure because they're salespeople, but it's a retail environment, and that can be a tough environment. But he does the simple things. He knows what what sport your child plays and that they had a game last night and to ask you about it. He knows that your favorite flowers are daisies, and so therefore on your birthday you get daisies. I mean, it's the little things, and that's the message to this book. And it sounds so simple, and yet, I read these articles, as I'm sure all of you do, about how do we engage people, and how do we this, and how do we that. How do we just ask them what they want? I think sometimes we make stuff a lot harder than it has to be. And so one of the things that we've got to figure out is, how do we get our employees and the team that's around us fired up about working on those strategic plans? One of the first things is going to be communication. We've got to communicate it out. We already saw that. Okay, but we'll look at this. That people have to be motivated. There has to be some link there for them to want to work on this. And that could be a financial link, right? It could be related to their pay, their bonuses, but it doesn't have to be. There are other things certainly that we can link in there, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so you guys fill in the blank here. Our most important asset is our people. Okay, so we know this, right? Duh. Question is, we as HR hopefully believe this. Does the rest of our organization believe it? Or is it the banner on the wall that says safety is our #1 priority, and meanwhile, if OSHA came in, they'd shut us down, right? What is that pervasiveness? And again, I don't mean to preach to the choir here about that people are our most important asset. We also know that they're one of our most expensive assets, right? For those of you that are reading your financial statements, I'm willing to bet upwards of 30% of all your operating expenses are people related. It's a huge line item. And so if we look at that list of why plans fail, how many of those came back to people? Clearly communication did, right? The passive management and people not being engaged did, and the motivation did. And so, like anything else we do in HR, how we communicate, how we involve other people in this, not just our employees, but peer level management folks and upper level management folks. How we get them involved and bought into this is going to be absolutely critical in whether or not we hit the company goals, and certainly whether or not we hit our HR goals. What else might feed into an overall strategic plan? What are some things that you would need to think about? How do we use our processes and procedures to make things more efficient? Okay? Oftentimes that's not part of a strategic plan, and that's a great piece, right? How do we take what we have and make it better? Okay? What else?
How do you reach your audiences when your workforce is like maybe 4 to 5, say, generations?
So how do we reach our workforce? How do we communicate? So we've talked about the issue of multiple shifts. We talked about huge workforces. We've got the generational thing going on. It's not easy to communicate anymore, right? But that has to be a piece of our strategic plan, that communication piece. And I would take it even one step further and say, how do we communicate things in terms that our people understand? And I don't mean that to say that we've got dumb people working for us. No. What I mean is it relevant to them and their job? If you talk to your administrative workforce and you say, our goal this year is to increase revenue by $1.2 million, how many of you would say that your admin workforce would say, oh yeah, I know what I need to do to contribute to that? Anybody? No, they say, well, that's sales job, right? Sales has to go out and sell 1.2 million more widgets for us, and then it'll happen. No, we all have a stake in that, right? So when we think about that communication out, it's critical. What is in it? How do I impact that piece of our strategic plan? So the communication out of the strategic plan, we have to really look at that, and we're going to dive into that one a little bit more. What else goes into our strategic plan? Yeah.
Your own internal competency to be able to address future changes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
Your own internal competency of your staff.
Okay, so staff competencies, right? So do we have the people on the bus that we need right now? And maybe you do. You're sitting there saying, I've got a great team right now. Then my challenge is, what does that team need to look like in 5 years or in 10 years, right? What kind of things are coming down? How is our business model changing? How do we need to look at a recruitment model that we may not fully understand what's going to drive people in 5 to 10 years? Okay, that's a huge challenge for us in HR. What else would go into a strategic plan? Yeah.
Need to understand what all the other operational parts of the organization are doing, and what
Thank
their
you.
strategic plan is, and how we are going to assist them in
Thank you.
achieving their strategic plan.
So I would challenge all of you to take a look at your typical day, your typical week, your typical month. Have you ever gone on a ride with an outside salesperson? Have you been on the floor at 2 o'clock in the morning with your third shift? And not just to hire, handle some crazy employee thing, to just be there, okay? Again, that's basic stuff, but it goes a long way towards understanding what those folks are going through. One, it'll make you a better recruiter and a better HR person, clearly, but it'll also help you to truly understand how the dots start to connect. I was working with an organization where everybody complained about the HR director, including his own staff. And the number one complaint that I heard was he never leaves his office. Okay, now this was it was a retirement community. They called it a campus, right? And so they had all the different, they had dining halls and the living quarters and all this stuff spread out over I don't know how many, 100 acres, okay? And so after I had talked with various department managers and the HR team, I saved the HR director for last. And I didn't go in guns a blazing saying, everybody hates you. No, we don't want to say that, right? So I said, tell me about your typical day. And, he's telling me how busy he is and everything. And so finally I said, well, one of the things I've been hearing is that you're not out and about a whole lot. He says, I'm behind my desk all day long. I can't get out from behind it. I said, well, what's keeping you here? What's going on with that? He says, you wouldn't believe the amount of workers' comp forms I got to fill out and unemployment things I got to handle. I mean, he's telling me stuff that should have been delegated to his HR assistant. He was doing it. Why? I don't know. His comfort zone, didn't want to be out there talking. I don't know. But there's a sign of leadership issues within HR, right? The perception in that organization was that HR wasn't valuable, despite the fact that the other departments liked everyone else on the HR staff, because the head of HR didn't appear to be valuable, then HR wasn't valuable, okay? So we have to think about that. That's a great point, is what do we bring from an HR perspective to the rest of the organization? How do those dots connect? And we're going to look at that. What does our organization need to look like compared to what it does look like? Okay? Are we flat and maybe we need to build some depth? Or are we too deep, need to flatten out? What does that need to look like? That might be a strategic imperative for us. And not just for the sake of change. So nothing we're going to talk about today. In fact, I'm kind of giving some thunder away for later on, but we don't want to be flavor of the month where we're constantly changing stuff just because, I got this great idea, I went to this conference, and we're going to do all this. We really got to process some things. So here's, let's take a look at some things that I threw in there. How about market trends? What drives your business? Do you really know what drives your business? What drives people to want the widgets that you make or the services that you provide? Why do your customers stay with you or find you in the first place? Do we know those kinds of things? Do we know what products and services we need to be making 5 and 10 years from now? How the market's going to change? One of the folks, I chaired the Pennsylvania State Conference, and one of the ladies on the team with me works for a company that was doing a lot of precious metal work and things, and they would make monuments for tombstones and things. Okay? Seems like a pretty solid business, right? You're never going to be out of business there. But they thought, we want to expand. They now are the main provider for the bus at Cooperstown and the Football Hall of Fame. How do you make the leap from doing bronze plaques for tombstones to having your work done and placed in two of the most iconic sports-related venues in our country? Take some foresight, right? Looking at the market and saying, hey, if we want to grow, here's what we need to do. Just going around the horn there, key business metrics. So if we know what market influencers drive our business, what are the key indicators that our business is thriving? Do we know those things? Do your people know those things? Let me ask you that. How many of you would say if you walked out to your average employee and said, do you understand how we make money? How many of you feel that your employee would say, oh yeah, I know how we make money? And have an intelligent answer for you about how we make money? Only, I don't know, half a dozen of you, okay? So we need to think about that for a minute, right? You guys all know UPS, okay? Cut my HR teeth at UPS. When I say UPS to you, what comes to mind? Packages, what else? Deliveries, Brown, okay? Most people associate UPS with their driver, okay? Do you guys know that if you don't get your package on time, that driver has nothing to do with that? Not his or her fault. It's some hungover college kid working at 3 o'clock in the morning who threw your box on the wrong truck. You're never going to meet that person. They're never going to meet you. But they control whether you get your box on time. Not an airline pilot flying the next day air. Not the driver you see every day. Some college kid working the docks. Okay? And so the reason I give you that example is, how many of you have people like that? That are critical, absolutely critical to you completing your mission and your objectives. And one, do they know how critical they are? And two, do they know that criticalness connects the dots to whether or not your business is successful? That's huge. Think about that when you're onboarding these folks, because chances are those positions are the positions that are the higher turnover positions for you. The positions you do all the hiring. I see a couple heads nodding, okay? And yet they are the critical drivers of whether we hit a lot of our metrics. Something to think about. Financial, I guess we could talk about that. Environmental, I would call that a close relative of the market. But what's going on in the environment in which we're operating? Are we finding more regulation coming in that we have to be concerned about? Are we finding less regulation? What's going to allow us to do business? There was an article in, what was I just reading yesterday? Something about driverless cars. Who do you think is the biggest industry that is concerned about driverless vehicles? Transportation, right? Go to any truck stop in the country and you will hear truck drivers talking about being against driverless transportation. Why? There's 3.5 million truck drivers in this country that could be out of a job in 20 years. Okay? We start talking about an environmental change, that's huge when you think about it. What if your company is transportation and you're not planning for that? Because it's coming, right? I'll get you one sec. Depends on what theorist you look at to determine how soon it's coming. Some are saying it's going to be here by 2020. I was saying no, maybe 2040. But it's coming. Yes?
I love the Sam Scan and Go app. I don't use a cashier.
Ah, okay.
So for those that have had a foot in the retail world.
Yeah, so self-checkouts. I mean, we're all so used to that. You can go to the grocery store and you can self-check yourself. And I mean, I prefer that, actually, sometimes. But you think about that. A good business friend of mine wrote a book a number of years ago called The Perfect Labor Storm. And he opined in this book, and this was written early 2000s, that we were heading into a huge challenge, right? Baby boomers are going and all these other things are happening. And a lot of it, we joke about, a lot of what he predicted didn't happen. But what he couldn't predict was the recession, the crash, which kept a lot of the baby boomers from retiring. And because of that, we didn't have the labor shortage that we had, or that he was projecting. That technology has certainly helped curtail and eliminate some jobs. So, we never know what's necessarily going on. We got to be able to look at our crystal ball sometimes and say, what do we think? What's going on with our company? How about customer feedback? Do we know what's going on? What do our customers think about us? Are they dealing with us because we're the only game in town? And then if another provider shows up, they're gone. That could be a challenge, right? How do we know? Do we have the ability to incorporate customer feedback into our plans, or maybe even into our employees' reviews. Anyone do that in here? Do what I would call a true 360. So you guys do?
Well, we do for our physicians.
Okay.
Their peer review.
Patient surveys or something like that. Yeah, so why not, right? That's who they're designed to be taken care of. So let's go ask those folks. Let's talk to our vendors. How are people dealing with you? I'm very conscious of when I call places and you get the proverbial gatekeeper, right? You can be rude to that person. You're never getting through the gate then, right? There was an article on LinkedIn the other day I read. Sales guy was frustrated. He was soliciting a CEO. He didn't give any of the details, but he was talking about how after 2 or 3 emails, this CEO wrote him back finally and said, if you don't stop emailing me to solicit me, I'm going to charge you for my time dealing with your emails. Now, that's not a guy I want to do business with. But one of the comments in the article was, how much you want to bet that same CEO has salespeople out there trying to get through to make sales? And the point of the article was, it's okay to say no, right? It's okay to say, gee, Ed, thanks, I just don't need your services right now, we don't have a match, whatever. That was sort of the whole point of what that article was. But you think about that from a customer perspective. What do our customers really think about us? If you're in the retail industry, the hospitality industry, you can get that on TripAdvisor and Yelp, and you can get some of that solicited. For the rest of us, that might be a little bit more difficult. And then so the last one is competitor info. I'm not talking about corporate spying here, but what are our competitors doing? Do we know who they are? And not just our competitors for our services or our products. How about our competitors for our people, right? So when we look at that, what do we know about them? What do we know about what they're offering their people? What makes what they're doing different? How could we use some of that intel to better our operations? So these are all things that we should be thinking about, not just from a corporate strategic plan, but as we're formulating our HR plan. Because they're going to look, when you look at this list, right? Think about what part of HR, do any of these not touch a part of HR? Not really when you think about it, right? Certainly it's going to impact your retention of people. If you don't know what your competitors are doing, you start losing good talent to them. Certainly how we recruit. You look at the environmental factors, how tight is the labor market for the kind of folks you need. Looking at our financial, what can we afford to do for our people? Okay, maybe we'd love to give them the world and we just can't do it. Okay, well we got to do the best of what we can, right? So all of these things require us to be a much broader business person than just being a great HR professional. And that's, we all know that's where our profession has been headed for some time. Okay, so let's look at how we link this to overall business strategy, and then we'll get into some nuts and bolts. Okay, so when you look at this chart, it almost kind of looks like an org chart in a way. But you have at the top your overall organization's strategic plan. And for half of you, you don't know if you have one. Okay, so that's the first thing we got to figure out is, do we have a strategic plan in our organization, right? But I'm willing to bet that even if you don't know if you have a strategic plan, you likely are given, or perhaps if you're real lucky, you get to help develop some strategies and tactical plans. How many of you have some say in the tactical side of your business operation? Okay, so much more of you have that, certainly, than knowledge of the strategic plan. And that's a good thing. So at least there's some. We've got a bit of a disconnect here, right? But you start to get some say at that point. Now let's look at that next level there. So we could list all kinds of different departments. I just picked the most common ones. So what do we need to know as HR people about the other 4 that I have listed up there? And how does that impact HR strategic plan?
What they want.
Okay, what they want and need, okay? Because what they want may not be what they need, okay? What else do we need to know?
Where they're going, what their plans are.
What their plans are, right? So we're privy to our tactical plans. Do we know how our tactical plans support or perhaps conflict with their tactical plans? How do we keep there being conflicting challenges there? What else do we need to know?
We need to
Yeah.
know if part of their plan includes staff, changing in staff,
Okay.
getting rid of staff, bringing on more staff.
So we got the staffing issues, right? Maybe, especially from a frontline perspective, if we look at sales and marketing, they might have, if we go back to that last slide, they might have a really good sense of what's going on with the customer base, the marketing pieces, and the environmental piece, right? They could be huge buckets of knowledge for us. So we want to spend some time with those folks. Their salespeople are probably out there. I know from a UPS perspective, the drivers are a tremendous source of knowledge for that management because they see what's going on. They go in to pick up your packages and they see, oh, wait a minute, I got 5 here, but FedEx has 20. Well, let's go. I'm going to go back and talk to sales about that and see what's going on, okay? So what about our frontline people, whether it be sales or maybe it is some kind of delivery service or whoever is dealing with your customers on a frontline basis? Can we rely on them for some knowledge and input? What else do we need to know about these other functions to help us? Yeah.
It would help to know how they're constituted. I mean, if you have a whole department where everyone's close to retirement, you need to know that. If you have a department that has a lot of turnover, you need to be aware of that to maybe identify some issues in that way as well.
That's a good one, right? So, what do we know about the demographics within each of these functions? I got a call a couple years ago from an organization that wanted some strategic planning. They were starting looking around, and they was a small group in that they were only concerned with this one division, and there was 4 people in that division that were absolutely critical to the success of the organization as a whole. 3 of them were retirement eligible within 18 months. It gets better. The learning curve for that job, 2 years, minimum. This was a public sector entity, so they couldn't pay what private sector was. So recruiting was going to be an issue. And I was supposed to come in on the white horse, okay? But think about that from an HR perspective, right? We're the subject matter experts with those kinds of things. And you guys probably have similar stories, right? Of people asking you to do things, and not because they waited till the last minute or failed to plan, but maybe they were just naive about how long these kind of things take, right? And then we get frustrated because we're like, oh, I'm not a magician, I can't do this. And then they say what? HR won't do anything for us, okay? So maybe we need to be a little more proactive. Maybe we need to look at some of those things, right? What is the demographic? What's the makeup of that workforce? Do we have critical positions in it that if I lose 1 or 2 of these people, what am I going to do? I talked to a small business owner where his most critical position, without a doubt, was his R&D guy. And this gentleman was early 60s and would not give the owner an idea of how long he wanted to keep working. Financially, he was fine. He had a bit of an equity stake in the company. They had grown it together. So, there was nothing financial driving him to necessarily stay for a period of time. But here again is the challenge, right? The transfer of knowledge. And this gentleman was unwilling to transfer knowledge to anybody. So you have 2 things at play here, right? You've got this key position, this bastion of knowledge, and an unwillingness to share it. Okay, that's one problem. What's the other problem?
He won't tell you when he's on stage.
I'm sorry?
He won't say how.
Okay, won't say. Yeah, let's look. Yeah, that's a problem. Let's look outside this gentleman. What else is a problem here? Yeah.
You haven't built a team around him.
No infrastructure around him, which puts us in what kind of position? Extremely, right? The beer truck comes along and hits him. Problem. Okay? Now we have no one in that role. So again, are there things like that going on and we don't know about it? Again, some of you are working for extremely large organizations, so you may not have the pulse on every single thing that's going on. You have to rely on some of these other departments and to get that knowledge, and that's okay. We just need to make sure we're taking time to go do that. Okay? So, let's look at how all this kind of impacts us, and again, how we create the link. So we talked just now about a succession plan issue, but let's look at some of these other things. Someone mentioned earlier about organizational, or org charts, excuse me. How might they need to change based on what we're doing with our HR strategic plan? We take our plan, and do we try and jam it into our existing org structure, right? So, plenty of companies do, don't they? That's just a very common thing. Oh, this is what we're not going to change it. Boom, here it is. Okay? Or do we have to start looking at things? Now, here's the challenge. Most strategic plans are multi-year, right? So let's just assume a pretty standard strategic plan of 3 years. That means at most we should be changing our org structure up about every 3 years. Okay? What if you do it more often than that?
Resistance.
Okay, we got resistance. What else we got?
Chaos.
Chaos, probably.
You create an uncertainty
Okay.
for people, and it might
Yep.
be hard to keep people might be out there looking because they don't feel any stability.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, one of the signs of an unstable organization is constantly changing stuff around, right? Like we're searching for the answer. We don't know what it is. We'll just keep shaking the bag and throwing everything out, see what happens. Okay? Sends a horrible message to our folks. So we have to resist that as much as possible. Okay? So yeah, I would advocate when you look at your strategic plan that you say, okay, well, how does that blend with my org chart now? And what might need to be done with that? Does anything need to be done? Do I need to throw the whole org structure out, or can I just tweak part of it? Do I need to flatten out for just a little bit? Do I need to deepen just a little bit? Just start asking those questions. Do we want to make those decisions in a vacuum? No. This is where I think sometimes HR, we can be our own worst enemy, because management will say, well, the org structure, that's your job, HR, just go figure that out. And then we come back, we know that's not a good way to go. So we've got to get through to management that this has to be a coordinated effort to figure out how all of this is going to piece together. Okay? Let's talk about culture for a little bit. So we mentioned one thing about generationally, right? What are we looking at in terms of our workforce? I know one of the things that frustrates the heck out of me, and I don't know about you guys, but you open up any magazine related to HR, you follow LinkedIn stuff, and all you hear about is how to attract and retain millennials. Why? Let's think about this for a moment, okay? I am not anti-millennial. That's not my point, okay? My point is, how old is the average millennial right now? They're not 25. They're much older than that. Okay? Remember, depending on what theorist you look at, millennials were born anywhere from what, about 76 to 82. That's when it starts, depending on who you believe, right? Let's just take the furthest out, 76. How old are these people? They're 40 years old. They're having their midlife crisis. They're out buying convertible Corvettes right now. And we're worried about how to attract and retain them. These folks are probably some of our leaders. Okay? I get so frustrated when, and still, and the only thing I'm thinking is, because for the last 15 years, a lot of people have made a lot of money talking about millennials. Let's just keep riding that train. Okay? Who should we be worried about?
Gen Z.
Gen Z, they're coming. They're in college right now. The first batch of them is coming. We don't know much about them yet. Okay? Shouldn't we be figuring it out? What's it going to take? They're our next set of doctors. They're our next set of engineers. They're our next truck drivers. Whatever it is you do, right? How are we going to convince them to come work for us? That's what we should be thinking about. I'm not saying forget about the millennials. I'm saying they're probably half your workforce now. Yes, sir.
Well, actually, I had a discussion with my president about a week ago.
Okay.
Where I teach generations in the workforce. And she said, Keith, I need you to get our organization ready for this deluge of millennials and Generation Z that's coming. And I said, we're already 70%. Right now, our workforce is 70% millennials and Gen Z. It's here. It's done.
It's here.
It's too late for that. Let's just work on taking care of stuff.
And I talk to my millennial friends, and most of them, and those of you millennials in the room, you can agree or disagree, that's okay, say, we're tired of being singled out. I was at our local chapter had a mixer a couple weeks ago, and was sitting there chatting, and this one young lady, she's like, Ed, I'm 32, my husband and I are getting ready to have kids. Why is everyone still worried about me? I'm a big girl now, you know? And I said, yeah, you're right, you're a big girl. Why are we worried about the millennials? We should be, again, if we're looking at the future, why are we focusing any more on millennials than the Gen Xers in our workforce, right? Because we're not that much older than the millennials, and there's only a handful of us, okay? Now, yeah, just one guy's view. But we have to think about that from a cultural standpoint in our organization. What other cultural things might be going on that we need to be concerned with?
Diversity.
Okay, diversity of all other natures, right? Let's just forget about gender and race. Let's look at everything else that makes us different, right? And there's actually, you know, depending on what you read, there's a heck of a lot more making us the same than different, right? So, you know, I always laugh when folks want to talk about diversity. Like, okay, the more we point out how different we are, the harder it is to figure out how much the same we really are. So let's think about that, though. What does that mean? What does diversity mean to your workforce? Okay? Is it just a race issue in your workforce? When they hear the word diversity, do they automatically think race? Are there workforce that think it's a gender thing? It's just the men and women. Is it just the generational issues? You know, what does that mean, right? So that's the first thing you've got to take a look at from a diversity standpoint. When we use the D word, what does that mean to the folks in our organization? Okay? And why does it mean that? What else? Yeah.
So, I'll just, along with, I know you've got new technology next, but there's a huge difference in the way these different generations have been brought up with regard to how they communicate and how they want to receive
Absolutely.
information. And as an example of that, in one of our positions, we had to actually encourage a young lady to use the phone because she didn't do phone calls. She did text and Instagram. And, well, can I not reach our customers via text or email? Is that, why do I have to call them? So it's the
It's a whole,
entire environment around how they communicate.
Sure.
How the different, so it's a
So
cultural
I would absolutely agree that that's a cultural issue, and it absolutely ties into technology as well, right? So culturally, are we communicating in ways that our people want to be communicated with, that our customers want to be communicated with? I'm starting to see more and more of my customers texting me.
Yeah. That even goes to content, how you present content, because I still love printed pages. That's just such a waste.
Sure. Sure, for a lot of folks, right? We'll talk a little bit more about the communication piece. We started with that. We're going to kind of end with that as well. But it's critical. How do our people want to be communicated with, and how are we sending that message? I was doing a few focus groups for an organization that had seen their employee opinion survey just tank one year, and they wanted to figure out why. And so we had a cross-section of folks in there, and things are going well, but we kept hearing about it's communication, communication's a problem, and I couldn't figure this out because on the surface, it looked like this company was going above and beyond in terms of how they communicated to their employees. They had regular town hall meetings with the plant manager. You walked into their cafeteria, bulletin boards with anything you could possibly want to know. Now, one, it was almost overload, right? So one of the shop floor employees said, Ed, let's walk down the cafeteria. I want to show you those bulletin boards. And so we went, like, okay, yeah, I've seen this. No, take a closer look. This was a German-owned company. Everything was not communicated in German, but close. All revenue figures were in euros. When the plant manager stood up, she communicated in terms of euros. We're going to increase by 1 million euros this year. Now, I don't know about you guys. I don't know what the exchange rate is. Okay? So we're standing there, all this communication, and yeah, we would have a sense of, oh, it went up or it went down, but I don't know what that means. Is going up 1 million euros a good thing? Is it what? So little things like that are just, how long would it have taken someone to just hit convert and talk in terms of dollars, right? And this is a well-known company. I guarantee you, all of you have their products in your home. This isn't some, so we can't sit and point the finger, oh, it's just some little mom and pop, they don't know what's going on. No, the big companies do this too, right? So from a communication standpoint, are we communicating not only the way our people want to be communicated with, but in terms that they understand and can relate to? Huge. So let's talk about the new technology piece. How does that piece play into our HR planning? Okay, could be how you recruit, right? Recruiting is a lot different today than 10 years ago. It certainly was 20 years ago, right? What else? Yeah.
How we communicate, how we track time.
Communication piece, time tracking, data tracking, right? HR and big data is the newest thing, right? Where do we get all that from? Yeah, something else?
Benefits, self-service.
Benefits, sure. I mean, we know technology is a necessary evil. So do we employ it to the best of our ability? And do we use it in ways that, again, our employees and those around us want to use technology? So education and communication comes back with that one as well, all right? How about, let's skip over the facility upgrade thing. Let's talk about the new products and services. How does that play into HR?
Training.
Okay, training for your people, right, on those new products and services.
Talent acquisition.
Talent acquisition, right? Who are we going to get that's going to help us develop those things? Steve Jobs, one of my favorite quotes of his is, it doesn't make a lot of sense to hire smart people and tell them what to do. We want to hire smart people and have them tell us what to do, right? That's pretty cool. That's what we're talking about here. Do we develop the next whiz-bang product and then go find smart people to help us implement it? Or do we bring people in and say, here's our business model. How do we get out of just doing gravestones and get into the Football Hall of Fame? A little different, right? Using the same metals, the same processes, totally different process, totally different sale, the whole bit. So how do we recruit that talent to make those things happen? How else does that impact us? Yeah.
Sometimes if you got that new product or service through a planned strategic acquisition, you have to think about the cultural impacts, the integrations, even the tactical decisions, the benefit changes, all of those things, if that's how you acquired that.
Thank you for bringing that one up. How many of you have been involved in a merger? Bunch of you, right? How many of you that have been involved was HR one of the drivers of integrating the companies? Again, 6, 7. Okay. Problem, right? I was involved in one as an internal employee, and guess what function ran the merger? Wasn't HR. No, not finance. You're getting closer. Not sales, you're getting closer. Marketing. Sure it does. You've got a locked-in mug, right? So if we give everyone locked-in mugs, we're all locked in now. And you know what? I'm going to give you a little pen, and that pad is all going to have locked-in on it, and we're going to change the decal on the door, and it's going to be Go Team. What? Finance, for their part in that merger, on paper, it looked smart. Our two firms, identical sets of services, identical sets of customers, but operating in geographically distinct areas. Makes sense, right? Huge sense. Until the merger happened. And then you find out you didn't date long enough, okay? Because the cultures were diametrically opposed. There was never going to be a coordination there. It was darn near impossible. They finally started listening to HR, where we started moving managing partners into new offices to start, well, we're a legacy such and such firm. No. We're all this company now. There's no legacy anything, okay? We had to get that language out. But even trying to move staff around, the way they did things was so different. Guess what? The company doesn't exist anymore. It blew up. Literally, it blew up. They lost, it was a professional services firm. Within 2 years, they lost 2/3 of their equity partners to other firms. Gone. I mean, the company no longer exists. All because of a failed merger. And all because, that merger should have never happened had HR been asked to the table and really some due diligence done on the other company. Because our firm was the gobbler there. It was a shame, right? But that plays into this. Now, how about operationally? We don't often think about HR being involved in operational change, but how does that play into our strategy?
I have a story for that.
Please do.
Our distribution center changed inventory processes, electronic inventory
Okay.
processes, and we weren't involved in that. HR wasn't involved in that, and then we started having turnover problems.
Mhm.
Couldn't understand, so I actually went and spent half a day on the floor. It's like, well, we're not hiring the right people.
Mhm.
We're not hiring the skills you need. So the
Sure.
people that we brought on board, you're never going to be able to train them unless they develop skills, more computer literate. But it was a complete mismatch to
Sure.
what we were hiring for.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so HR has to be involved. I saw an example on a shipping floor where the company brought in some engineers to do time studies on how they were running their shipping operation. And they said, well, let's change this, let's change that, move this around, move that around. All made sense on paper until they implemented it. And it was a nightmare. They spent $30,000 on this, only for 3 months to go by and they went back to the old way. And what didn't they do? It was the one thing that could save them $30,000. Talk to the employees about how, we want to change this, we want to make it a little more efficient. How do we do that? How do you guys recommend that we do that? No, we brought in some folks that may or may not have been good, and it was a shame. So, if my presentation is posted out there, I want you to take a look at the World at Work model. I love it because if you look right here, everything starts with that business strategy, right? And our HR strategy and our organizational culture comes out of that. And so that's why we spent so much time looking at those two pieces, right? How does the business strategy really connect in with everything else that HR is doing? And then that wraps around everything we're doing from a total rewards and an engagement. I love this diagram. And you can actually pull it off the World at Work website. Okay, so we've hit just about everything so far today. So we're in the home stretch here, but we've talked about the recruiting and training and succession planning. We've talked about how we may need to use technology to better serve our people, to better serve ourselves when it comes to HR as well. The one thing on this list we really haven't talked about is the whole work-life fit and total rewards. What does that have to do with our HR infrastructure? Well, it certainly bleeds into motivation, right? It bleeds into how well our people perform. We all know happy employees, productive employees. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because I'd be preaching to the choir here. But in terms of our strategic plan, let's not overlook those two pieces and how they can drive all of these other elements that we've been talking about. Are our people rewarded in a way that they feel valued and that they're willing to commit to the cause? Because that's huge. We can have all the best plans. We just talked for almost an hour about all these great plans. But if we don't have our people fired up to implement them and reward them for that implementation, it doesn't matter how good the stuff is on paper, right? So again, if you look at that World at Work model and how all that bleeds through, that visual's worth 1,000 words. Okay, so here's your homework. Okay, we're not going to have this open discussion now, but in terms of getting this started back home, go back to if you have an HR team, I would start with your HR team first on these things. Have this discussion in your next department meeting, and then start to involve some of the other department managers in the discussion with some of these questions. Where, from a perception standpoint, where are you currently in terms of your business life cycle and where you think you need to be? What's the perception of HR? Are we getting the job done? If not, we need to be open to that critique and that feedback so that we can fix it, right? It's hard to hear that criticism sometimes, but we need it. We need to know how we're doing. And then, what do we do with all this from an HR planning perspective? So ultimately, what we're looking at doing here is becoming much more proactive as a function. Instead of reacting, and we go back to the beginning of the presentation where we saw that sometimes we're involved in setting our own tactical plans. That's great, but that's reactive. Strategy's already been set. So from an HR perspective, how can we use the things we've talked about in here, the things on this list, to become much more proactive in our approach to supporting our organization. Some of you are probably sitting here saying, gosh, I want that seat at the table. I'm not there yet. My company doesn't get it, whatever. These are the kind of things, this kind of proactive approach, where you start asking the hard business questions, is just one small step towards getting to that strategic table. That's one of the ways that we're going to be able to demonstrate our value as HR professionals to our organization, regardless of what the perception is now, whether you're good or bad. We can raise the bar for ourselves by handling some of these types of things and showing how HR is integrated into the organization, and we're not just overhead. Okay? That without us, the organization really would be struggling. Okay, so next steps. We just talked about kind of getting to the table, but also take a look at your organization's strategic plan. If you know you have one, you haven't seen it, ask to see it. If it's top secret, I got to wonder about that. Okay, what's in that plan that it's top secret? But then get to work. Think about some of the things that we've talked about today. What do I need? Which of these pieces? Maybe some of them don't apply to your particular industry, and that's okay. But what do you need to do to start pulling some of this together? What discussions do you need to have? Who do you need to have those discussions with to get the information you need to pull your strategic plan together for HR? Thank you so much for your willingness to chat and share.